Today I would like to make a little bit of a basic tonal harmony function. Most of us use the tonal harmony every day as performers, and we learn it in theory. We don't always use it as a fact on the keyboard unless we do keyboard harmony, as they call it, for continuo or accompaniment of figured bass. But it doesn't hurt, as my teacher used to constantly do, to rehash some of the facts of how things happen to become. So every time we think and play, we can be more in the cloth of the work, in the making of the hearing, of the understanding of the writing while playing. And sometimes he's opening obvious open doors, and sometimes he's connecting dots that were just not always connected but gone to the next stage because anyway the fingers overwhelm the brain, and sometimes the ear being such good guide, we sort of intuitively go into the step 2, having not completed step 1, because that's how life is anyway, and not everything is linear, organized, and always step by step, even if it would be ideal. And my teacher, who finally died at the age of 94, it's terrible to say finally, but I meant to say constantly renewed the beauty, evidence rather than simplicity of the understanding of the harmonic tonal harmony procedures, functions. And it started always with the quintessential skeleton, which is the circle of the fifths, the 7 fifths, known to all of us, with the order of the sharps and the order of the flats. And the reason for which this circle is so visibly obvious when we watch it is that we always think of north and south pole for the top and the bottom, and we have perfect fifths going one way of the clock or the other way, and therefore the sharps would be to the right, C, G, D, A, E, B, F sharp, and of course the flats, keys, F, E flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, and the bottom is G flat, and going up is F sharp. So on both sides we reach the tritone, which is the lock of the system, the north-south pole, the tritone, the devil in music, as the Gregorians used to call it, when they used to sing in parallel fifths. We'll see that. But anyway, that circle of fifths is locked by the tritone, which creates that tension, which resolves in open or in close. And interestingly, there were 2 resolutions themselves create a tritone, G and D flat. It's like a vicious circle system that allows us to have always at the end of the 7th, 5th, need to resolve, open or close. So there is a tension and a release at the core of the harmonic, tonal harmony. And this idea of the circle of fifths is also melodized by the singing that Gregorians did. By jumping one of the fifths, you obtain a step. Over G is D, over A is E, over B is F. So you obtain the step motion, and if you jump over 2 fifths, you obtain thirds, or 6. So the movement of the scale with the 2 tetrachords is the reduction of the 7 perfect fifths. Becomes, well, without the last one, because obviously it's the first. So there's 7. And the reason for which I insist on this for the understanding is because when we think about each tonality, the name of the tonality is the tonic, of course, in the case of C major. And if we think of the 7 fifths, very often we think first from the C, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the edge of it. So in another tonality, let's say G major, the first fifth would be C, the subdominant, which we call such because of the scale, when it's sub under the dominant as a step. But in the fifth circle of fifths, the subdominant is dependent on the dominant. So it's perfectly balanced, what we call the plagal cadence compared to the dominant perfect cadence, or the combination of C and D together in the dominant seventh. In other words, the system is based on locking through the tension release of the tritone. But the circle of fifths, when we want to display them in every tonality, we have to start from the fourth degree, or the fifth under the tone in this case. And it helps to think about that, to understand that, with the order of the sharps and the flats and the key signature as well, which we will see in a moment. Meanwhile, it's interesting to observe that when the Gregorians were singing in the Psalms, in, let's say, perfect fifths or octaves, with Guido d'Arezzo, that monk, who started calling this ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, for the beginning of each of the stanza of the different psalms they were singing, as the tone from which to sing. So it was almost like the pitch note. And he called it ut and not do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. But there is no, obviously, the devil in music, because the devil being temptation, tension that needs release, which is all what monks were searching in their connection directly to God, was to be away from the human temptations. And so they sang pure unmajor, non-minor. There is no third in the Gregorian, so it's not minor or major, it's just perfect fifth. So no mode, minor, no major, and no leading tone, no tension. And when they had to go through the seventh note, how do they do? To avoid the tritone, they would start in alteration, in this case F sharp, because obviously the tritone was a disturbing interval, not perfect, and couldn't be parallel, therefore had to be resolved to a third, which they don't do. So basically, to avoid it, abstain. In C major they would have an F sharp for the perfect fifth of the B, in order not to have a leading tone, diminished fifth. Also, in other instances, they would start breaking the parallelism of their fifths. Instead of going to an external note, as the F sharp in this case, they would use breaking the parallelism by staying as a common note on the sol in this case, going to mi, to avoid either or. So in fact, this diminished fifth, augmented fourth, we call tritone because of three tones. In order to avoid it, create so much creativity. Either altered chord note, either break the parallelism, which gave the birth to polyphony, because then you could go in opposite directions, so-called contrary motion. And so the parallelism, therefore, disappeared little by little to profit the contrapuntal polyphony of poly in Greek, more, and phon many, phonos many voices, but not doing the same thing. They started having different movements. Well, obviously they didn't use the tritone for that very purpose. So in the order of the fifths, let's say in C major, Fa, Do, Sol, Re, La, Mi, Si, or reduced, in order to have it in step motion of the for the scale, we create what we call two tetrachords. The bottom, from Greek, four sounds, tetra. Bottom and top built the same way. Then tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone. And therefore, if we start C major, bottom tetrachord, top tetrachord, and then the top tetrachord becoming the bottom of the next, if you add another tone, tone, semitone, you have to add F sharp, in which case in G major, leading tone F sharp, key signature first sharp. Then if you continue the circle of fifths, the top of G major becoming the bottom of D major, you add another tone, tone, semitone, leading tone, so you have F sharp and C sharp, the two sharps on the key signature in D major, A major 3, C, F, E major 4 sharps on the key, B major 5, and then F sharp major. Anyway, you reach C sharp major with 7 sharps, after which you switch to flats, because after 7 sharps you have to have too many double sharps. And then it becomes D flat instead of C sharp, A flat, and then E flat, 3 flat, B flat, 2 flat, F major, 1 flat, the B flat, and back to C major, which makes us able to play through the circle of fifths in scales by tetrachords, which are each the top of becomes the bottom of the next. C major, G major, D major, A major, E major, B major, F sharp, C sharp major, A flat major, E flat major, F major. I cannot speak fast enough what my fingers play. That's too explanative, but if you just overlap, you only play a single tetrachord, which is in fact becoming the next. The circle of fifths of the 12 fifths without the tonal circle of 7 fifths with the tritone of the 7th. Yeah, exactly. You continue. So they call it sharps going up and flats going down. So this kind of play of tetrachords being constructed the same way allows us to travel through the major scales of the circle of fifths with the tone, tone, semitone, leading tone to tonic organization. Of course, each of the tones of the scale becomes a degree, and this degree is melodic in this case. Tonic, subtonic, medium, subdominant, dominant, overtonic, overdominant, leading tone, and tonic. I don't know, in every country they have different way to call it, but the point of the matter is that they come from and they become. So here they have a harmonic meaning, because each of them can be a chord. And here they're just melodic to be sung without harmonization right away. It's more about the singing capacity of the elements of the chord, of the tetrachord that constructs the scale. I know it's a confusing thing when I say tetrachord, because it sounds like chord, and chord is thirds superposed, and tetrachord is 4 steps motion. Also in the scale, the first, 4th and 5th degree are the tonic, subdominant, dominant, determining for the tonality, and then 3rd and 6th determining for the mode, major or minor. So if it's minor 3rd and minor 6th, it's in C minor. If it's in major, it's major 3rd, major 6th. And 1, 4, 5 are for the tonality, for the subdominant and dominant. So each of the notes, except the 7th, which is its only function, is to be a dominant leading tone that is attracted magnetically to the tonic. This way the scale is clearly the emanation, the result of the circle of fifths, and bypassing 1/5 to create the step motion of the tone or semitone. Naturally, you have ascending minor and descending minor on top of harmonic minor. All that to say that because unlike major structured two tetrachords, the minor obviously doesn't have two tetrachords built the same as in major. Therefore, the top has to be either major tone tone semitone called ascending minor, or descending, where if you consider descending, the first tetrachord is major, tone tone semitone going down, which would be also major. It doesn't sound like this, but it is. So it's like a hybrid minor, up major tetrachord, under tetrachord minor, or the harmonic minor, which is with the -3rd and -6. But in order to do that, the leading tone becomes further away because it's obliged to be next to the tonic by semitone attraction. So between the 6th and the 7th degree, there is a gap of a tone and a half, which is more than a step. It's a step and a half, obviously. It is more used for harmonic purposes rather than for singing purposes in the tonal harmony of the Western, let's say, 200 or 300 years between Bach and Ravel. So basically, we are involved in a tonal system where most composers that we play on the piano, especially the piano romantic composers of the era, 19th century, they all use already what Bach established and had received himself. So a lot of circle of fifth skeleton are more or less hidden in alteration and ways of the stylistic covers on top. But once you look at each progression, you can retrace quite easily the harmonic structure, skeleton that is quasi-Baroque. Now, of course, since I did the 7 or the 12 key circle of fifths, when I modulated in every key with the chord or when you squeeze the complete 12 circle of fifths, then you become a chromatic scale of 12 tones. Commonly sharpening going up. So between C and D, let's take the tetrachord of C major. We add a semitone. Between C and D is C sharp, between D and E is D sharp. Between F, E and F, nothing because it's already a semitone. Between F and G, F sharp. So we sharp our way up when we need to add a semitone, and same on the way down. We flat B and A flat, E flat and D flat. Sometimes we still sharp the F sharp because of the so-called secondary dominant to dominant motion, which is a harmonic motion 5 of 5. But if it's G flat F, it would be a secondary dominant of flat 2. Commonly called the Neapolitan 6 in the first inversion. How you call it, how you spell it is a bit of esoteric situation for most pianists because they don't have a different key for the different quarter tones. So G flat F or F sharp G is the same black key on the keyboard. So obviously that doesn't have the same tension release to go up or flat or to slide down intention other than the intention harmonic you put in it in terms of your determination to it. And it all depends how it's harmonized, as I said. Some people don't consider it as important how you spell it as long as you hear it. You feel it, you feel that tension and release. But of course in written harmony it's more meaningful than in played keyboard harmony, because in keyboard harmony obviously you have only one key for both. But the reason for which I insist on this dominance and secondary dominance is because this is something which is important to grasp at the get-go for understanding how the basic universe of the tonal harmony is organized, is all about the perfect cadence, tonic to dominant, dominant rather to tonic, which which incorporates the leading tone, which is the magnet to the tonic, and the seventh to this chord, which is the subdominant in the tritone, the famous tritone of the circle of fifths, based on the dominant, and the tritone, the dominant, is the leading tone, the fifth, and the seventh we call dominant seventh. Again, this is always what determines the tonality. So in a way, you could say that the tonality is the name of the key, like C major. It's only C major because the dominant in its tension tritone FB is there. So the most important cadence to end any piece and determine any piece's tonality is to have a strongest, obvious, driven connection is 5-1, perfect cadence. And of course, each of the degrees of the tonality, like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, of the scale, can have their own secondary dominance, which would be also in rapport of fifth dropping, and it will be 5 of 2, which is a D minor chord, because in C major we have no black keys or no sharps or flats, it's easier to visualize. Same way on the third degree, we'll have a dominant, and all these rapports 5-1 on each degree become secondary dominants because they're not as important, like 5 or 4. The most important of the secondary dominants being the one that is the dominant of the dominant, because it leads to the dominant to end. Then you have a secondary dominant on each degree, therefore in the 6th degree, which is A minor. And then you don't have a secondary dominant on the 7th degree because it's diminished. Or you could, but then you'll go in B major, B minor, but there's no more a dominant leading tone. Secondary leading tone dominant doesn't exist. It's really about being able to reproduce the same as the main one, which is the 5-1 of the tonic itself. So that's why sometimes we refer, very often actually, more than sometimes, to secondary dominance. To be noted, the pentatonic in Asia, or the full tone, mostly Debussy, are 5 or 6 tones which have no leading tone. No tension, no release, and no harmonic necessity to harmonize, organize roots with fifths. So it's very melodic modes, and of course there are many modes from ancient Greece through ancient Rome on each. And all these modes with different Greek names are mostly melodic modes, where the perfect fifth only happens since they always dropped down on what today we call the subdominant. It's the Dorian, etc., the Solidian. But they disappeared little by little into the tonal systems in this, well, much later than little by little. It took centuries and centuries. But let's say what we call the tonal harmonic system is loosely between Bach and Ravel, so it's like end of 17th into beginning of 20th century. So, and still minor adjustments, obviously. And the 7 clefs are for the notation, but that is not evident and necessary for the keyboard harmony. The intervals are in. The intervals are of course, space between 2 given tones of the scale, and their inversion always combined gives 9. So let's say 2nd, 7th, 3rd, 6th, 4th, 5th, 5th, 4th, obviously 6th, 3rd, and 7th, 2nd. It's important to visualize the intervals in their inversions for their equivalence, because sometimes in the circle of fifths we have, so the circle of fifths is up a 4th, down a 5th, up a 4th, down a 5th in the bass, not always displayed because of course of question of range. Piano keyboard has the largest range of most of the instruments, therefore we can do, sorry, but in most instruments you have to go up a 4th to go down a 5th to make all the circle of fifths in a smaller space. So we have to think up a 4th, it's also a 5th. and down a fifth is also up a fourth, obviously. So 6th and 3rd, 2nd and 7th, 4th and 5th. The chords are constructed by superposed thirds. So we could call it that the first is the root, sometimes omitted, most of the time played. 3rd, 5th, 7th, in rapport to the root, obviously. 9th, 11th, 13th. Well, if nobody goes so far, because first of all for the hands, but with the orchestral capacity you can. And the dominant is normally a tritone, a triad. Confused tritone and triad. Tetrachord and chord. Oh, I'm confusing everybody instead of helping. Okay, let's go back. Tritone is for 3 tones. Triad is for 3 superposed thirds. Tetrachord is 4 for 4 sounds. And a chord is just combination of sounds. A chord, which means d'accord from Latin or French, it means in agreement. Okay, so this confusion hopefully cleared. The leading tone is the most important note to the tonic. But if we want to build a chord on each of the degrees, we would use in C major the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th will be a major 7th if we stay in the 7th. In the 2nd degree, minor 7th, because of the minor triad and the minor 7th, minor triad and the 7th too, on the 3rd degree. So 1st degree, 4th degree are major 7ths, 2nd, 3rd and 6th are minor 7th, and the 7th on the 7th degree is a so-called half diminished 7th, or leading tone 7th, when it goes to the tonic, and half diminished if it's a 2nd degree, let's say of A minor, but that is another function of the same chord, which 99% of the time in major, obviously 100% of the time in major, is used as a leading tone 7th. It's important to revisualize the tonic, the dominant, the subdominant, and if you add the chords of the subdominant is F, A, C, the triad of the tonic is E, G, and the triad of the dominant E, G, B, D. So now you have your 7 sounds of the tonality by thirds, when you had them by fifths, here by thirds, or here by step motion. So it is an organized hierarchy of importance of the tones by the even name of them. The dominant dominates, the leading leads. In French it's called sensible, which means a sensitive tone, because it has to go to the tonic. And so we have different chords when we start adding beyond the 5th, a 7th. In the case of C major is a B. And if you add another on top, it's a 9th. So it becomes a major 9th. If you take the example of the dominant, tonic, dominant, this is the dominant's root in C major G. The first third is the leading tone. The second third, which is the 5th to the root, which is the dominant, is a perfect 5th. Minor 7th, which is the subdominant in the degrees, which creates a 7th, minor 7th with the root, and a tritone tension diminished 5th, David in music, between the 3rd and the 7th, which locks the system to close and resolve itself in C major. If you go above, you have a major 9th, in rapport to the root, which is the dominant. And if this dominant 9th is played, you will hear here. But if it's a dominant minor 9th, you will have still the resolution, but with a minor tension feeling, even if it's still resolved in major, and not obviously in minor. And if you take from this dominant chord, which is a dominant 9th minor, and you omit the root, you have a leading tone chord, which is in fact a combination of two interlaced tritones or just minor thirds, is the so-called diminished seventh. That diminished seventh is in fact a minor, is a dominant ninth with omitted root. And the omission of the root is very cunning, because in a way it allows for this chord floating sort of without its bass to be resolved in so many directions. As a matter of fact, it's allowed to be resolved in every direction. There are so many ways to resolve a diminished seventh, as many as the 12 tonalities in which you can resolve it. So when you want to have the universal limbo, is the diminished seventh. The four major, to make it simple and clearer, resolutions of it would be to search for a leading tone at a different note of these four notes. For instance, if the first note, the root of this diminished seventh, BDFA, is the leading tone, you go to C, because it has to go up half step. But in this case, the omitted root is G. So it's an original dominant minor ninth with omitted root. But if the original root is E, then leading tone is G sharp. We would call it E, G sharp, B, D, F. And then we go in A. And if the omitted root is C sharp, then we'll call it C sharp, E sharp, G sharp, B, D. And then we go to F sharp. It's a universal plug that goes in every tonality according to which is its omitted root. Or here the minor ninth omitted root, in which case it's, if we call it in flats, B flat, because it's easier to spell. B flat, D, F, A flat, C flat. And so if we resolve in the four times that we could resolve in root, first, second, and third inversion the same chord, we resolve it first in C major, in A, F sharp, and the four resolutions of the dominant function of diminished seventh are also creating a diminished seventh of their own. And since there are only 3 diminished sevenths chords on 12 tones, obviously 4 times 4 is 12, then the third one is the first. Composers like Liszt use the diminished seventh in concerti, in sonatas, everywhere, with a dramatic effect of limbo, expectation, dramatic effect. You never know where you are, where you're going. And of course, in order to go into the tonalities that are the other 8 tonalities in which you can resolve the diminished seventh chord, but no more as a natural dominant with leading tone function as these 4 ones were when you respelled it with a different root, then you have to make it into an altered degree for another tonality where that chord doesn't exist, obviously, originally. And then, for instance, you can go and consider it as, if it's spelled with a B, as a sharp 4th degree. And then what do? You go in F major. The B is sharp 4 in the F major. And if the D is the sharp 4, in which tonality is it? A flat, etc. So under different altered functions, you can, from this universal plug, go to a different of the one of the 12 tonalities, the main 4 being as dominant. What is fascinating with this chord, the diminished seventh, is that it's constructed by 2 interlaced tritones. So it creates a double tension, if anything, on top of the resonance of it, but also of its functionality as a dominant, with or without, with obviously omitted root as a minor ninth. So this kind of constructions of chords are very interesting to observe, because we always like to think of it as, let's say, I like to imagine it like shelves on a library. So you have the bottom shelf, the second shelf, the third shelf, the fourth shelf, and each separated by more or less major, minor, according to the alterations, so not thirds. To the, after the 9th, to the 11th, to the 13th. So according to the way you space the shelvings, you can have a minor 13th, a minor 9th, an omitted root if you take off the bottom shelf, and then you take off even the third, and then you alter the degrees differently to obtain different colors, atmospheres, tensions that create different intervals to resolve them more in an altered way through the regular. And so this kind of play on altering seemingly obvious notes which are part of a given tonality brings us to elaborate more striking chords which appear like something else, like this, the dominant of D flat, but in fact is nothing but the alteration of consecutive different elements on a given dominant chord without its roots. And so sometimes theoreticians don't agree, theorists rather, don't agree, that's the word, between themselves about some analysis of which chord is what, and under which analytical way do you hear it in terms of its melodicity or its harmonicity. And so you have people who try to get into Bach's first prelude. And so of course they put the degrees of the scale under to realize the skeleton. 1, 2, 5, 1, 5 of 5, G, in the modulation in G, 5 to 1 in G, then return to the secondary dominant with a minor 9th omitted root of D of F. C, F, the subdominant, the dominant pedal. We call it pedal, not for the piano obviously, but for the harmony. And then the tonic pedal with 5 of 4. So if you listen to the first prelude of the Well-Tempered as a reduction chordal chorale, and it's displayed, repeating each chord twice, organized by Bach. So up here the first degree, second degree, fifth degree, tonic, first degree, sixth degree, circle of fifths. So in other words, you start hearing the circle of fifth skeleton, which is reduced to the melodic scale, small space of the keyboard on which it was played for the harpsichord. And if you establish the degrees, then you establish these movements of fifths. So it will be, and at that point, what does it help you to know that? It helps you only to understand at which place of the circle of fifths we are when we go in G major, we go to F major. So it's sort of a GPS, I would like to think of it, of the harmonic structure, when the density of the urban map makes you not visualize exactly the way the streets are organized if you're down walking on them, and if you elevate yourself above in a bird's eye, you realize immediately in the mapping where you are and where you're going, and how you can intersect. An intersection reaches that street at this point and not on another, and so it becomes almost like a crossword puzzle visualization of the whole piece as a construction. teacher was teaching us the basics of keyboard harmony through first the circle of fifths, as I just demonstrated, but also by the functions of the chords by simply taking triads as a for clarity before to go more complex. In the way they are organized in the tonal system. For instance, the first cadential section, fragmented here, is the 5-1 with the leading tone and the common note, and the fifth going to the third. And so in many cases, students would just plug them and sort of like bang them, and then it should insist on the quality of practicing on the piano, even the simplest harmonic progressions, in order to get familiar pianistically for pianists who already play complex things, as well as for, let's say, conductors, theorists who don't touch the keyboard all the time, to become a sort of like scales for velocity of fingers. I'll be for velocity of brain harmonic progressions, to practice the sequences through the sequence of, let's say, the perfect cadence 5-1 on each degree, or with modulations, with the secondary dominance becoming with the altered degrees, or just in the same key. And then here the melody of the bass line moving with the melody of the soprano, with the common note of the alto, with the movement of the tenor in contrary motion to the bass, but in parallel 6 with the soprano, and then sing 1. If you sing the alto, do, re, si, do, la, si. If you sing the tenor, or the soprano, and so you create legato by horizontal voice leadings rather than chordal slices of chords, like a slice of a cake, which of course is correct, but she wanted to enhance our hearing of the horizontal layered voice leading while organizing the vertical functional harmonic motion by knowing which degree of the bass goes to which type of chord goes to where is the leading tone, etc., which is the common note, not to repeat it, and how to play legato even between the two thumbs of two hands, the tenor, in order not to play something disjointed, because we have to hear them as voices, virtual voices, not obviously sung voices, but the virtual of the voices makes us hear better the function, who goes where, who stays, who moves, who can do a contrary motion compared to the bass, and then start learning the basics of beautiful, meaningful voice leading, string quartet part writing, or on the keyboard, or vocal disposition with a more spread 5th over the 10th, rather than the 10th between the tone bass and the alto. No, that not. Why? Because you don't want, you shouldn't, and you won't have parallelism. That is sort of like the quintessential boredom of the spirit, the lack of intelligent thinking, which would be to accept that you just play successive chords. Just like triads, the Gregorians did only by the fifths, without functional harmony, without leading tone, without tension, without release, without major or minor. As soon as you play triads, you have a major, minor, third, you have a leading tone, you have tensions. In other words, you have to manage the hierarchy of the tones, their combined tension-released situation or delayed situation if it was a tonic. Dominant tonic is perfect cadence, but if it's a 6th degree, you have the same function of the leading tone of the soprano going to the tonic in both cases, but delaying the effect by going to the 6th degree, which has in common 2 of the 3 notes with the with the tonic. So instead of going 5-1, you go 5-6, 4-5-1. So you delay your arrival, which is a quintessential importance in voice, part voice writing or playing, because you realize that there are different ways you can connect the chords in order to reach the ultimate tonic through the dominant or subdominant if it's playing perfect. But you can start from another degree, another fifth, which would be the third, the sixth, the second, the fifth degree if you go up and down the fifth, fourth. As we saw earlier, the intervals invert. So, and then, but you have to play it not, as very often it's easy first to do because you just think function but not voice leading, or you think voice leading but not function. You have to think function to understand how it moves by the bass, but melodic voice leading, isolated. And of course the reason for which the parallelism is not accepted isn't because it's wrong or ugly, obviously. It's just a question of not aesthetics, it's a question of games, rule of the game, which is how to have the most creative voice leading organization that allows to have melodic lines even for inner voices, not just the soprano, and searching for the most harmonious way they will I was gonna say like fishes in a pond, they will glide around each other harmoniously, interlace, sometimes tense to resolve, tension, tension, dissonance rather, the disease, and then consonance, and that. And we would go through the different degrees, organizations in every key. Sorry. So what we would do in order to organize this learning process or getting familiar with the keyboard, with the harmonic progressions and played in a legato way with observation and attention for the common notes that are not repeated, etc. You do first, of course, the basic, which is the sequence of the droppings of the bass line, but by fifths. But then you have the possibility to invert and go up fourths. That you reproduce, let's say you go drop is fourth, up a tone, down a fourth, and then you play, and you visualize the parallel thirds, which are authorized not fifths, fourths, but thirds and sixths, yes. The two soprano and alto, and the tenors, and you sing them while you play them alternatively. Hand, and you try to think, disincarnating the passage of the chords in their connection from the hand playing, but just thinking the voices by either singing one and playing three, either cross-handing, so that you don't think in terms of bass in the left hand only. So you think in sort of a zero gravity, each part for itself. The chords by themselves often are played with the root and the two inversions in the case of the triads, which is obvious because there are only three tones, and therefore the root becomes in the first inversion on the top, and we have the third in the bottom, which is known as the root, or they have the fifth on the bottom, which is called the sixth or sixth-fourth chord. And these inversions are obvious because we invert the order of the notes, but they're the same notes. What Mademoiselle Boulanger, my teacher, was asking us to do is to understand the function more than the note change, because a given note can be any note, but the function is what determines how we think of it in terms of root, first or second inversion, sixth or sixth-fourth chord. In C major, the root is C. If C becomes the third, instead of going on the E, C with the third of this chord, but the C itself becoming the third, then the chord would be A flat. with its root, A flat, C flat. And because C is the bottom note, then not to confuse bottom note with root for most people at the very get-go. Of course, it's a very basic fact, but it doesn't hurt to be repeated or to be understood clearly. In the first inversion, sixth chord as we call it, because of the distance between the bass note and the top. And then if C, same note, changes function, becomes the fifth this time, then the root has to be a fifth under, which is F, and the chord is F major triad. In this case, if C remains on the bass, we call it 6/4 to separate it from the sixth chord, which is third sixth in fact, just to separate it because it's always a sixth, except it's major sixth in this case, and the chord is F. So we have root position, first inversion, second inversion with a major triad. When this is the root, this is the root, and this is the root. To visualize, but we don't play it. Instead of playing, we do. And on the same basic principle, we can do it in minor, in diminished. The problem with the augmented is that it's just like for the diminished seventh, the spelling that makes a difference. But the spelling doesn't speak by itself on the piano, so we have to visualize it, or demonstrate it rather, visualize it. Demonstrate it by resolving the leading tone in A minor, in F minor, or in C sharp minor, a different minor according to how you like to spell it. So major triad with its inversions, root, third, fifth, or minor, root, third, fifth, diminished, and augmented, root, first, second. And of course, once you start with 4 sound chords, like the dominant seventh, and the first inversion, second inversion, third inversion, since there are 4 tones, we have the root, third, fifth, seventh with the same notes, just rearranged, reshuffled. But if we want to keep them as function, only changing on the same note, then the root of C becomes the third of A flat, or of the fifth of F, or the seventh of D. So then, equivalently to the triad, which is root and 2 inversions, here would be root and 3 inversions. Or we can do the same for the major seventh, or for the minor seventh. Basically, in order to understand the fact that the note changes function rather than the, well, it could change with the note, but in order to visualize it, we stay on the same note. And then this brings us to understand that the very construction of the chord being a tree of branches by thirds, or my other analogy being the shelving with the different shelves altered or missing sometimes, we have to also think of it more like a canonic superposition of inversions. Like, let's say, to simply demonstrate, the root, the third, and the fifth for the triad. And you play this in arpeggio very slowly. 3, 4, 5, 1. So the root, the third, the fifth. If you start playing the note after it in canon, immediately after, when you play the third, you play the root. When you play the fifth, you play the third. When you play the root again, you play the fifth. Because it's just shadowing it. And if you do the third part starting in the third note, you have the third and the fifth and the inversions. So it's more like if I displayed. But in a small, it makes you understand that in fact the roots and the inversions for third and fifth are nothing but the result of a canonic or delayed organization of arpeggios, which are the displayed chord. And there is a cantata by Bach that is very demonstrative of that, or demonstrative of this, I'm sorry for my English, is the G major opening of the cantata 202. And it has strings playing like this, 16th rest, 3/16th, for violin 1, and violin 2 plays 8th note rest, so just the 1/16th behind the first violin. Viola dotted 8th note rests with the 16th note starting there for the third 16th in a row. Sorry. So if I play together, I hear, and that's what we hear. We hear triads with inversions. But when you visualize on the score, you see canonic arpeggios at one note distance, filling up the space of what are in fact heard vertically by slice chords, but originally displayed as canonic voice leading. Horizontalities, layered tracks, which isolated is a vertical function through the bass note. So the difference between the chord as such, how it's constructed, or omitted root, or altered 9th, 7th, 3rd, whatever, it's the way we construct the chord. And then we put it in society, make it live around the circle of fifths land, and then it starts moving itself, saying, okay, I'm going to delay before I finish it, and I finish. Can I go from 4 to 1? Yeah, we call it plagal cadence, but from 5 to 1, perfect cadence, and then half cadence, and then imperfect cadence, from 1-5, 1-4, 1-5-5-1, or 5-1, but in first inversion. All variations of the main so-called perfect cadence that in a way locks, closes and finishes the piece at the get-go, or determines the tonality of the piece rather than the piece itself, which is why most of the preludes exist in Bach, is just to determine the tonality, and after you have the fugue that develops the voice leading. At least in theory, because sometimes he uses a lot of contrapoint in the preludes as well. But that is digression, digression, digression. Digression is the cancer of the teacher, as brain thinking, because too many digressions confuse the purpose, and too much simplification doesn't allow to understand the complexity of the purpose. Well, that's why some people are pedagogues, and some are just explanatory people like me trying to explain. But I like to think that it's possible to be able to not dwell over those things, but think of them in a way that you understand them. And sometimes it's enough, as I said earlier when I introduced this talk, about the fact that it's to do with the lack of a missing link, like how come the leading tone doesn't always go to the tonic, and what is the tritone exactly its function compared to when it's not going to the tonic. In other words, you can it's a thinking process that allows for understanding the different way the chords behave in the society of tonal system, and how they exist by themselves, but then they exist mostly through the functions. Of course, you can alter their functions to the point to which some composers in different centuries used differently the harmonic progressions, and sort of made it their trademark. And you say, oh, this is a Franck cadence, and this is a Brahms cadence, and this is more reminiscent of this more than of that. And so we were, in our studies with my teacher, we would not only first play, like, let's say, the diminished seventh, as I mentioned, as the major interesting chord, because it can be going in different keys as a dominant or as a sharp 4. By the time I even say it, it's already too late because I've played it. This is as a sharp 6. I know that it's like very difficult to demonstrate on the piano without the score. It's like watching hockey on TV. The puck is too small and goes too fast and you don't visualize it, but not everything can be visualized right away. It has to be, of course, in written form first and then played. But in terms of the harmonic progressions, let's say 4-part, using the C major as a basic key since the beginning of the examples, of course, transposable to each or modulating in each. Let's say you take 1, 4, 5, 1. You can do it in D, in A, in E, in B, in F sharp, in C sharp, in G sharp or A flat, in E flat, in B flat, in F, and back in C major through the 12. Or you can use it only as a C major, the notes of C major triad, and only change its function, and then therefore you'll modulate. Sorry. If it's a 4th degree, you go in C, in G major. In F major, it's a 5. So by itself, the C major chord can be so many different things to different keys, tonalities. Or you can just do it by transposing. And think of the voices. And you produce it chromatically or by fifths. Sorry. Or modulate by using this function. Then, so if C major is 1 is in C, if it's 4 is in G, obviously, and if it's 5 it's in F major. And this way you start playing with the voices in terms of their organization, and you search for the, essentially in voice leading you search for step motion, the very point of singing and thinking of the voices as such, majorly searching constantly, importantly, not majorly for minorly, just meaning the major attention being, that's what I meant to say by this adjective, is to search for common notes, which you don't repeat. And then for the 4th part, usually you search for something that's not parallel, because you'll be in trouble by parallel fifths, which is no more Gregorian days. And therefore we have to search for parallel, lack of parallelism by doing opposite directions and searching for contrary motions. And that's how you start hearing the... So you don't repeat the C because it's a common note. And then... So the different voices move in different directions. I know it's very obvious when you play it, but when you start thinking about it from the root on, the minor triads to start, you enter in the capacity of understanding, shaping, playing the different chords in their different dispositions, in their different functions. And I think it's as much a brain game, or rather a brain training than game only, as much as it's velocity, clarity, or slow equality. To do the unequal fingers to sound equal with passing of thumb. And to do, or and then virtuosity, the keyboard harmony one, because you are allowed to be playing with not the individual fingers for the scales or the but you could adapt it also and play and do the different harmonic roots and inversions in arpeggiated factor. But most of the time I wanted to give this parallel between practicing the fingers for pianists and practicing the chordal progressions for keyboard harmonists. And that pattern of thinking develops quickly when the neurons connect the dots, instead of just doing it on 4 parts written, but you can start playing it, and therefore you can start playing the continuo to a Bach cantata or to a flute sonata by Bach that has only the bass line. Of course you can buy the scores that do have the realization suggested by a scholar, which is printed, but you also can think about yourself to realize, why is this bass note in Bach 5 and this is 6, and which chord does it mean, and then how, and then start to think in terms of the music from the root up, rather than only all the notes that you just recite because they are all on the score and every one is as equally important. Of course there are hierarchies of chords, they're not indicated on the score because of the subdominant, the dominant, the second degree, the sixth degree, and how they organize themselves. But all this is food for thought, for a good interpretation. And of course, and I said earlier, the F sharp G or the G flat F doesn't speak by itself, but when you play the end of the Schumann fantasy, and you've practiced chromatic scale, secondary dominant, let's say, you realize that in Schumann you have do, si, la, sol, si, e, b, a, g, f, e, e flat, d, and the d sharp, e. And perhaps you don't need to know how they're spelled, but you realize by thinking that one side the sharps is the ascension, and one way the circle of fifths and the flats is the dropping. And so in the chromatic melodicity we have the tension up to the sharp, and then the B flat with the descent, except the subdominant, secondary dominant. It's always the except that is always difficult, because it ends up by being like French grammar. The exception confirms the rule, but if there are more exceptions than words in the rule, then you understand the rule by the exceptions, which is very confusing for most. But it's very passionately interesting, because once you understand a little bit better, you're able to clarify things, and you understand and hear better what you play in the pieces you play. How they are organized. Oh, it's a minor 9 for the meter towards diminished 7th, with a major 3rd, relative major, 5 of 6 in C minor. Interesting. Or is it, I'm in F minor and this is a relative major, so it's 5 of 3, because I'm not in C minor at this point. So you understand how to organize, how to understand, perhaps how to learn better, even memorize by a structural point of view than only the fingers, how they come on the keys, which is also important. The visual memory for the placement on the score of the notes of the bars also helps a lot. I don't think that there is one that prevails over others, but it is true that knowing in this GPA sort of mapping of the performance, where you are nothing but tonally modulating, going, where is my second theme, where am I, which key am I going, just knowing where you are constantly helps a lot, instead of being in a foggy tunnel and going like, wow, that sounds right, but I'm not sure what I did wrong, and then you stop in the middle of a piece, which you know because you played over and over, but from the surface down rather than from the roots up, as if you were to rewrite it yourself, not of course to recompose it, but to understand it, and possibly eventually to summarize it by the chordal progressions, which most students do by writing the Roman numbers of the degrees, but also eventually to copy by hand if it's not too complex a score, to realize what it is to take, just to write it without, away from the keyboard. Oh, that is really good, because then you really appropriate it, and you can almost play with, unless you made mistakes in the copying or in the memory, reproducing it on the paper, to play it from your own edition, so it's no more Urtext, the famous German word for original, but your text. And everything becomes more familiar, and you feel like you're in a familiar land. Like, I went to this city and I went through all the streets, and now I know that city is downtown, and I can show you little ways to get around, and you feel familiar with that. So for me, that's mostly what it is to help the pianists when they perform know where they are in the piece by deduction. The topography is more obvious and more clear. I think that is very meaningful, because it helps the memorization, and it helps in moments of stage fright, when the pianists lose confidence in themselves or are distracted because of the situation of being on stage and being watched is not obvious to the self-esteem, and everybody feels it differently reacting to that stress factor or fear, and all of a sudden the logical thinking doesn't come in mind, and nothing comes, and so if all of a sudden, like, where am I in the piece? I don't even know the notes of the piece. But in fact, if you have written it down, and you did in your practicing, reduce it chordally, then you start knowing where you are in the piece. And you realize that, oh, second time I'm going to go to the 6th degree, I'm going to return through the tonic, okay, the dominant, and so you just map it in your mind right away. It's like you're never lost in a city where you've been through the different streets, because you visualize how they're connected. But sometimes when you arrive in a new city, you just are wondering, because sometimes you don't right away. Some brains connect better the dots than others, because you develop that kind of analytical thinking, which is exactly what it is for the basic harmonic progressions of the tonal system. Well, so far I tried to be clear, but I'm afraid I was more confusing, because I was trying to come up with too many exceptions to the rule. But I hope it was more or less instructive. Hopefully more than less. Thank you.